All right, so proof number one for our parallelogram unit that we're going to do together. Why don't you take a minute? I will write my givens in while you pause. So go ahead and pause, write the givens in, mark them in, and think about what they mean, and then we'll talk about how to get this thing set up. So go ahead and do the givens now. All right, so that's what we have so far. We know that this shape is a parallelogram, and that's a really, really important piece of information. So like we've always talked about, they're not going to give you stuff that you're not going to use. All right, we know all our parallelogram rules now. We briefly went over that at the beginning of class. So what that does, that unlocks a whole ton of information. We know that tells us that the opposite sides are congruent. We know that tells us the opposite sides are parallel. We know that tells us the opposite angles are congruent. It tells us all that stuff, and that's really important when it comes to proofs because we need that information. So we got to keep that in mind. The other thing we know that hopefully you marked in was that PS was congruent to QT. All right, and that's the other thing they gave us that we know we're going to have to use somehow. We're trying to prove that triangle QRT is isosceles. So we know what an isosceles triangle does. So here's triangle QRT. So that implies that we need to prove that two angles are congruent or two sides are congruent. So we can, look for hopefully angle 2 and 3 being congruent, or we can try to prove that these two sides are congruent. And hopefully what we're starting to realize is that they actually gave us a little bit of information about this side. They told us that QT was congruent to something. So that's kind of a good hint for us that we can maybe get these two sides to be congruent, and that would make our triangle isosceles. Since we already know one of those sides, we might as well try this other one. So thinking about what we know about a parallelogram, we actually know something about side QR. All right, back in the test that you guys did a great job with, we know for a fact, since this is a parallelogram, that side PS has to be congruent to side QR. And the reason for that is, we just talked about that, a quadrilateral is a parallelogram if and only if two pairs of opposite sides are congruent. So there's a nice piece of information. So now if we look at our picture and we mark in that PS is congruent to QR, you can see we don't want to make a second slash there, right? We talk about that a lot this year. We don't want to make two slashes if this is already a one slash congruency. All right, so now all of these three sides have one slash in them. And what that tells us, you can actually see it in the given and the step 2 as well. Right there, we have PS is the same as QT. We also know PS is the same as QR. So like I always show you, if we make up a number, I'm just going to call PS 5. That means QT is 5. It also means QR is 5. And that is our clue that we can use substitution. We can tie these other two pieces together. So since PS is the same as QT, and PS is also the same as QR, that implies those two are the same. So that can be the next step of our proof. We can say QT is congruent to QR through substitution. And thinking back to what we discussed at the beginning, we're done. We actually have everything that we wanted to prove from the outset. Remember, we wanted to prove this was an isosceles triangle. So if I just zoom in right here on our side of our trapezoid, and we zoom in there, that triangle is definitely isosceles. We were able to prove that those two sides were congruent, which makes it an isosceles triangle. So we're done. We can now say for a fact that triangle QRT is isosceles. And the reason we know that's true, we just proved it, first of all, but we know that those two sides were congruent. So we know an isosceles triangle has two sides that are congruent. So we're done. We have nothing left to prove. We did what we came to do, and we're done with that proof. Okay, so the really key thing for this unit is to use those parallelogram rules. All right, you should all have them really well memorized by now, but that's a ton of information that we can use just by knowing this one thing, knowing that that's a parallelogram. Okay? So if you want to keep watching videos, you can. If you want to try out number 2 on your own, it's a similar proof, but not the same. So try that one out if you want, but keep watching, and call me over if you need some help.